What's going on, guys? This is Ryan from Outpost, and since my last video, I've had a lot of people ask me, how should I get into the Star Wars expanded universe? And to be honest, it's a very good question. If you've never experienced the Star Wars expanded universe before, seeing the enormous amount of books and video games and comics, it can be a pretty daunting task to try to get into where should I start, because you don't want to hop in the middle of a storyline and maybe you've tried it before, but you didn't really understand what was going on because it's a pretty deep universe. So I wanted to make a video for people to start off on the Star Wars expanded universe. So there's a couple ways to go about it. And for the greatest chances of success, I would recommend making sure you start with something you like. So if you really enjoyed the Star Wars original trilogy movies and want to understand and kind of figure out where the characters went from there, I would recommend the post-Return of the Jedi era for Star Wars Expanded Universe. And it's not quite in order of when it happens timeline-wise, but what I would start with, and you're probably going to hear this from a lot of people, is Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Trilogy, starting with Heir to the Empire. The Thrawn Trilogy is really important because it sets the stage for how everyone would write these books from then on, for the most part, because it's one of the first real big hits of the expanded universe. And Timothy Zahn's world building ends up being reflected in a lot of everything else that you read, because his was one of the first. It introduces you to where our characters are at this point in time. You're not at the point where you realize that Han and Leia are married and they're having kids. Luke is still kind of figuring things out. He knows that he needs to restart the Jedi Order, but he doesn't know how to go about it. We get introduced to where the Empire is at as far as dealing with the crushing defeat that they had at Endor and trying to pick up the pieces from that. And obviously we get introduced to Grand Admiral Thrawn, who is a very famous villain in fiction history and has even been incorporated into some of the TV shows, specifically Rebels, that Disney's produced, because he's such a kind of a well-loved character. So if you read those books and you like them, then I'd recommend actually going back a little bit and getting into the X-Wing Rogue Squadron series. Now, the X-Wing series is more than just Rogue Squadron. Rogue Squadron's 4 books. The Wraith Squadron portion is also really good, and there's some other ones here and there. But I would definitely recommend at least reading Rogue Squadron. The reason being, you get a sense of where the rebellion is right after Return of the Jedi. You get to see how they end up retaking Coruscant, still referred to as Imperial Center at the time. You get a lot more backstory on Wedge Antilles, who we obviously know from the original trilogy, but he's not a very developed character. And he plays some key roles, but he's a very small part overall. You get to learn more about him. You also get introduced to someone named Corran Horn. Now, Corran Horn is also, like I was talking about, a very unique character and someone who is going to play a big role in a lot of things to come in the expanded universe. Next, I would move into the Jedi Academy Trilogy by Kevin J. Anderson. And with that, I would include I, Jedi after you read the trilogy. That is kind of an add-on at the end. It's very focused on Corran Horn and some of the things that happen in that trilogy. It is kind of critiqued by some. It may not be the strongest, but it is incredibly important to what happens later on. And I still find enjoyment from it. After that, there's a lot of kind of single one-off books. There are a couple series, but as far as importance, I would say the next one I would read would be the Karelian Trilogy. So that has a lot to do with Han and Leia and their children, and it takes place in the Karelian sector. You get introduced to Centerpoint Station, or at least you learn a lot more about Centerpoint Station, which is this very ancient, mysterious, what turns out to be a weapon that kind of plays a big role in things to come in the expanded universe. After that is the Hand of Thrawn duology, Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future. That's also by Timothy Zahn. It also kind of brings back Grand Admiral Thrawn, in a way, kind of. Luke and Mara Jade kind of further their relationship and ultimately realize that they do feel a certain way about each other, which is really cool. Now, if you've made it all that way, You're all the way through the Hand of Thrawn duology. I would just recommend, at that point, you're pretty invested. And if you've enjoyed yourself, if you really enjoy the characters and the stories, I would just then read on through the timeline. And you can kind of look anywhere. I'll put some links in the video to show kind of an overall timeline of expanded universe books that you can use as a guideline. But from then on, everything is pretty succinct in series. The New Jedi Order is 19 books and a lot to tackle. If you want advice on which ones are necessary, reach out, let me know, and I'll give you my feedback on which ones I think are vital. Everything else is, from that point on, is pretty much a must-read. Now, if you're someone who definitely did enjoy the original trilogy, but also really got hooked on Star Wars by the game Knights of the Old Republic, and you're really interested in that Old Republic era, then I would make a different suggestion. Although you can definitely start with Heir to the Empire, and that's fine. There are a lot of very cool stories from the Old Republic era. A lot of them are in comic form or graphic novel form. So Tales of the Jedi, which starts about 5,000 years before A New Hope, is a series of comics where we learn a lot about the ancient Sith Lords and Jedi that we hear referenced in the game KOTOR and KOTOR 2. You learn about Mark Aragnos and Naga Sadow and Exar Kun and Ludo Kresh and Freedom Nad and Jedi like Ulic Qel-Droma and Nomi Sunrider. And a lot of their stories that we hear a lot of references to in KOTOR, KOTOR 2, and Star Wars The Old Republic, the MMO, which is, I would check that out if I were you. I love SWTOR. It's not Knights of the Old Republic 3, but it is some great expanded universe lore and content, especially if you like the Old Republic. So after Tales of the Jedi, you get into a whole line of Knights of the Old Republic actual comic series. And this was a really long-running comic series. It went from 2006 to 2011. There was a lot of issues, and there's a lot of stories in there that take place right around the events of KOTOR. You get introduced to a guy named Zane Carrick, who's a Jedi, who becomes really important in these comics, and it's fun. Now, if you're not so much into comics, but you really want to read the novels, there are also Star Wars The Old Republic novels that tie into the MMO video game. Now, if you really like the video game, I would highly suggest reading these. Even if you don't, I still think they're good reads. So that would be Deceived, Fatal Alliance, Annihilation, and then Revan. Revan, the community's kind of split. Some people really enjoy the Revan book, some don't. Some don't think it quite is in character for him in the Exile, what happens in that book. But I would highly recommend playing the Star Wars Old Republic video game along with reading that if you're interested in Revan and in the lore around him. And then the last few books that I would really recommend from that Old Republic era would be the Darth Bane trilogy. So that really goes over how the Rule of Two was created. If you've seen anything else from the Old Republic, from the KOTOR era and things like that, you know that it wasn't just two Sith like we hear about in the prequels and on. It was far more. It was an entire civilization, an entire Sith empire. So Darth Bane takes place about 1,000 years before A New Hope, and it really explains how he came to that determination that two Sith alone, using subterfuge, would eventually be able to take down the Jedi Order. One to hold the power and the other to covet it. Now, if you were someone who really got heavily invested in Star Wars through the prequels, which a lot of people, I'm 30 years old, it's the first Star Wars movie I saw in theaters was The Phantom Menace. So the prequel era novels might be the way for you to go to really get into it. And I think the best place to start for that would be with Darth Plagueis. Now, we hear in Revenge of the Sith, we hear Sidious tell a story to Anakin about Darth Plagueis the Wise. Well, this novel covers Darth Plagueis and Sidious, and it really brings a whole new context into what was going on behind the scenes before The Phantom Menace and during The Phantom Menace. And it is an extremely well-written book by James Luceno. Almost anything by Luceno is actually really good, and I would recommend reading. But between Darth Plagueis and then immediately after that is a book called Darth Maul Lockdown. Those are really good ones that kind of give you a lot of insight into what is happening in the prequel era. Then you get into the Clone Wars, and there are a ton of standalone novels that are really fun reads. some of the ones that I would read if I were you would be Shatterpoint. That involves Mace Windu. It's a very well-written book and enjoyable. And another one called Yoda Dark Rendezvous. And it really covers how Yoda and Count Dooku are feeling on the inside and their relationship. And it's very interesting. So those are two I would recommend of the standalones. There's also a kind of a 3-book series that really delves into Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader. So that would be Labyrinth of Evil by James Luceno, the novelization of Revenge of the Sith, which gives you a lot more background and backstory on what's going on more than just the movie, and then Dark Lord, Rise of Darth Vader. Those provide a lot of keen insight onto what was happening right before, during, and after Revenge of the Sith, how Anakin feels before, how Anakin feels after, how he deals with his injuries and recovery, and the loss of Padme. And I would highly recommend those if you liked Revenge of the Sith. So that would be my recommendation for getting into the Star Wars Expanded Universe. Like I said, everyone is different, and how you start is up to you. I think that most people would think that the Thrawn Trilogy is probably the best way to start, but again, go for what interests you. If you don't like novels, then don't try to pick up a book and read it, because you're probably not going to like it. There's plenty of audiobooks out there. I would make sure you get the unabridged version so you get the full version. Otherwise, you get a lot of the story chopped out. If you really like comic books, I would recommend reading the comic books, reading the graphic novels. That'll give you the best chance to really get the most out of your Star Wars Expanded Universe experience. So I hope this video helps you guys out, and that I gave you some kind of good guidance as to how to get started in this grand Star Wars Expanded Universe. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe, smash the like button, and I'll talk to you guys later.